So welcome, everyone. Can't tell you how glad I am that you could join us with relatively short notice. I think I know everyone. Dr. Michael Giuliano and the Assistant Dean for Faculty, Resident, Student Development, and the person who's basically been running the RATTLED program over the course of the past, now it's almost 5 years. I can't believe it's 5 years since we've introduced the resident as teacher program across the network. And each year it evolves and changes slightly. We've just completed Rattle Part 1 just recently with all the interns across the entire network. And tonight we're going to be introducing Rattle Part 2 to those of you who have been bold enough to step up and to indeed volunteer, in some cases coercion, but volunteer to be Rattle champions in your individual departments. I just want to real quickly introduce everyone else from our team. Joe, can you pop your camera back on again for a second? Maybe Joe can't park. George, you want to introduce why Joe's coming back in? George, we can't hear you.
Now you can hear me.
Yeah, now we can.
Dr. George, I'm part of the faculty development team, and been with the group about 4 months now. It came from JFK. I was doing some teaching there. I'm a past scientist. From Roche. I did some sales and marketing at GE, healthcare in the past, and some teaching and some hospital work in Barnabas. Came full circle, back into, touching base, with all the different types of, people, in, healthcare education.
Well, you can't say you're new anymore, George. You've been around long enough now that you're.
I didn't say I'm new. I said I've been here about 4 months. So.
Joe?
Hi, I'm Joe Martinelli. Hopefully by now, should know everyone on this call. We've interacted in some sort. I think Dr. Hellman, we're new to each other. I believe you're new over in emergency department. Looking forward to working with you in Rattled this year.
And Frankie?
Hi everyone, my name is Francisco Rocho. I do see some familiar faces, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today.
Fantastic. Bert, can you mind sliding up and introducing yourself? I actually have someone live with me here at Hackensack.
Bert Zurich, I'm the program director of the surgical residency at Hackensack.
And Bert, you were a Rattle champion last year.
Yes.
That was the first year? No. How many years have you done? Okay, all right. So Bert's an old hand. And the rest of the room, Melanie, you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Melanie Kalfer. I am the Rattle champion for the Department of OB/GYN.
Excellent. And you're an old hand at this as well, Melanie, right?
Yes, I actually did my first Rattle session today for my residents, and I think it's the 3rd year that I've done it.
Very good. And who else is here? Syria? You still mute. Sorry.
Sorry. I'm Dr. Sarah Shaksai from internal medicine in Jersey Shore, and I was with the program last year as well.
Internal medicine where, I'm sorry?
Jersey Shore Hospital.
At Jersey Shore.
Mm-hmm.
And you did the program last year as well?
Yes.
Excellent. Very good. Well, actually, tonight's agenda is very different from what we've done in the past. You'll have access to all of the slides that are in this slide set. There's actually 200 and some odd slides. I actually put all the slides from all of the Rattle Part 1s in here, but that's not really what we're going to spend our time doing tonight. Actually, I'm going to briefly, and I think fairly briefly, go through some of our ideas about Rattle Part 2 in terms of making this material come alive and be an active small group teaching session. And then actually what I'd love to do is hear some of your experience, since everyone has already did this a little bit and they've actually run it. We've poked our heads in and participated in a number of programs. For example, surgery in particular, I think we've actually played a hands-on role both at Jersey Shore and here at Hackensack. But a lot of the programs you've run yourselves, we'd be very curious to see how you've indeed adapted the basic content for each of your different settings. But again, I thought it would be interesting just to have everyone get a little bit of history. I think we did this before, but as I said, this program, the Resident as Teacher program, grew really out of my own work, my master's thesis work almost 20 years ago, where basically I came to recognize in my own experience that the house staff are truly the fulcrum of the educational process. All the students watch them and they have the most influence on the students. And I think most attendings watch them. And indeed, I think the opportunity for, really the opportunity for changing the educational milieu is really most powerfully in the house staff. It's been utilized, the original work was done actually at SUNY Downstate and an affiliate of SUNY Downstate, but it subsequently has been used at least 5 different universities that I'm directly aware of. And I know bits and pieces of the program have indeed been adapted in a number of other sites. Indeed, we have some outcome data, although we're still looking to actually look into more outcome data, but we do have some outcome data from some of the original work that showed that it really improved residents' their perception of their own skills in terms of their teaching abilities and self-identification. Regrettably, what I'd love to see is outcome measures from the students in terms of the teaching skills of the residents, but we haven't been able to corral that outcome measure quite yet, but I'd love to work with someone on that particular subject. As I think everyone knows, we introduced the 6-part RATTLED Part 1 back in 2018, slowly and steadily expanded it across the entire network through 2019. And we've subsequently been doing it at all sites, either via Zoom or varying live events since that time. And it has subsequently matured and some would say mutated into a 2-part program where we've done the basics of giving out the ideas around RATTLED. And now we basically have reduced Part 1 into 3 large introductory sessions done by Zoom for all the interns across the network. And now have a Part 2, which is more specific and parochial to each specialty, run by RATTLED champions in small group settings in varied numbers of workshops, depending on your particular environment and how you sort of mix and match the core topics that we introduce in RATTLED. For those of you that I'm sure remember, but RATTLED is basically the resident as team teacher with a focus on the fact that indeed most residents are working in environments where they're interprofessional teams and other learners, obviously besides the medical students. The L is learner, and of course that's a strong focus of the RATTLED program, is to emphasize their own lifelong learning and the habits and structures that they need. E is educator, so obviously we want them to be far more than just quote unquote teachers, but really want them to have the skills and the knowledge that come with being an educator. And then of course the D is diagnostician, because of the concerns we have about diagnostic error and utilizing house staff to both teach diagnostic process as well as address diagnostic error in the clinical environment. And as I said, you've either volunteered or jumped in and have been involved now more than 1 year to help create these workshops that hopefully come alive and aren't just a repetition of the Part 1 slides, but really workshops, truly workshops, where the residents are actually have homework assignments and are doing things, either using the models or indeed creating things that are specific products for their particular environment. And again, it's really critical to indeed focus on the fact that we really like you to modify the content from the introductory materials and not just take those slides and really apply it in your context, create clinical scenarios and role plays that are context specific, and indeed modify them or add what is necessary for your particular setting. I can think of two departments in particular that have really modified things extensively. The emergency room has changed around the 1 minute learner extensively. And I think the surgical department has added a whole nother session on teaching in the operating room, which is really quite germane in their context and rather important. But I think we would all agree that the global goal for everyone, no matter who's involved in this program, and that obviously includes not just the residents at all years and levels, but ourselves, is that we really want to create structures for lifelong learning. We really want to make everyone comfortable in terms of what the tools are that you need to be a team leader and organizing a learning environment in a group setting, that you have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that really have to come with a giving, educator who's humble and serving their students. And of course, a trained evaluator, so that the evaluations are objective, are built on standardized processes that then lead to growth-oriented coaching and feedback to the students, and hopefully better diagnosticians who are more apt to indeed recognize error and hopefully learn from it and improve systems while they teach that process. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue with those sort of broad, big goals. The question is how to do it. So today's plan really is for me to just sort of very briefly just go through what part one is made of. And I think hopefully everyone is pretty familiar with it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. And then what I'd like to do after doing that is basically just walk through some of the outlines of the potential sessions. And I'd love for anyone on the line who's run sessions on these areas to sort of just jump in and tell us a little bit about how you've done this in the real world, in your particular context of either internal medicine or in surgery or in OB or any other setting. So I think everyone realizes we do a broad general introduction of the program during the orientation week in June for the entire network of interns across all the systems and across all programs. And that general introduction really is a pretty strong focus on the importance of the resident as teacher and their central role as educators to make certain that they understand that that's a critical part of their own professional development. And again, we spend a fairly brief amount of time just walking through the rationale for why it's so critical that they are trained educators and that they develop this skill along with all the other skills that they need to develop as house staff. We emphasize obviously that their residency programs and the RRCs all require this as a pretty core skill. And then I think, as everyone knows, we go through these, sort of sessions. There's 6 sessions in total that are listed here, but we actually do them 2 at a time. So we actually do Learning 101, Teaching 101 together, and we do Teaching 102 and Eval 101 together, and then eventually Eval 102 and Thinking 101 together. Learning 101 is all about their own learning. How do they create their own lifelong learning plan, their own self-directed learning plans, and how central that is to them being able to share their knowledge base. Teaching 101 really is about organizing learning in a specific clinical setting, especially around the issue of the 1 minute learner. And of course, teaching them about how critical learning objectives are. Spend a little time about how you organize a learning objective, where they come from, and of course, communication skills and the questioning skills that are so critical for an effective educator. Teaching 102, we actually talk specifically about models for clinical settings, in particular, how to do rounds in large groups, how to do rounds in smaller groups, and of course, some potential models for the student presentation so that there's some standardization, although we clearly don't expect it to be the same in every specialty. And then in Eval 101 and Eval 102, we spent a little time talking about the comprehensive evaluation tool, how it was developed from the entrustable professional activities. We spent a little time discussing what those EPAs are and how critical they are, these units of work that we can evaluate easily, and how they're related to the core competencies of their own education. So to make it clear to them that these are actually things that also are being used to evaluate them. So it's important for them to understand it And then, of course, the idea of how do we direct feedback to the students in a growth-oriented way. And then the last session sort of stands on its own, where we really talk about the diagnostic process, spend a little time talking about how we're teaching that to the medical students. It's a big focus in phase 1 of the school, and how the students are sort of having this diagnostic process framed. And most importantly, how diagnostic area is really a critical opportunity for learning about diagnostic process and potentially improving it in your own specific settings. And then, of course, we always spend a little bit of time asking them about how we might move forward in terms of the specific issues. Any specific questions before I sort of go into some of the potential outlines for some of the workshops? I'm just curious, for those of you who have been around and have seen part 1, listened to it, any particular parts of it that really strike you as things that are impactful to you? Or things that you think we might want to add? Bert, you're happy? Bert just said he's happy. That's a very good sign. Anyone else in terms of the aspects and the elements of part 1? Is there something that you, when you look through it, you go, I can't believe you didn't put that in? Or when you look at it, you go, I can't believe you did put that in, and is that really important enough to be there? Would you edit in or edit out any broad areas or topics specifically? I take it that that means it's perfect. I'll take the silence as assent. I actually do have 2 areas that I think that we probably, I think in retrospect, we have not focused as much on in the part 1. And actually I'll mention as we move into part 2, and that's the overt discussion about creating safe learning environments. It's implied, and indeed we do mention it, but it really isn't something I think we spend as much time on as we potentially can. Because if you don't have a safe learning environment, if you have people intimidating people or abusing people, clearly everything else that we're talking about falls apart. I think that that issue's become less and less of an issue over time, but I think, you know, we still see complaints that come from students about the learning environment. And I think it's really so critically important that we really focus on indeed creating an inclusive, respectful environment where everyone feels that they can make mistakes, everyone feels that they can contribute, everyone feels that they're part of the team and that they're in this positive environment. Have any of you had any concerns or issues about that subject, or do you think we do a good enough job with it?
I would say, hi, it's Sarah. I would say that, I would say that it still exists, that, you know, not having safe learning environments, you know, it does exist, like to a large extent, I would say, like, you know, intimidating attendings and things like that. I would say that that still exists, but that's something we have to overcome as a profession, I would say.
You think it's still a major issue?
Not major, but I do think it still exists. Like it's still there, basically.
Can you give me some examples?
Like for example, if I mean, obviously not in my personal experience. I mean, I hope I'm creating a safe learning environment, but I mean, like for example, if a resident were to ask an attending like a question and then to get like an abrasive answer, like, you know, like a question for the purpose of learning. And, you know, maybe they would get an answer that's, you know, sharp or something like that. So, I mean, I still see it, you know, to some extent, but it's definitely, it's not a major issue. It's just like still there.
And may I ask, how do you address it? When that comes up, I mean, obviously, if you see it in an attending, what do you do?
I usually don't don't, I mean, I usually hear of it. I don't usually like see it in front of my eyes, but I hear it from the residents. Sometimes that some attendings are more intimidating than others and things like that.
And obviously, if it's a pattern and you hear the same name over again, do you take it upon yourself, or do you utilize the residency director or someone else to actually talk to that
Yes,
attending?
yes, yeah, yes. In the past, we've had discussions with, our chairman regarding like some attendings who are like more, I guess, like I said, abrasive to the residents than other, so we've addressed it in the past.
And you feel that that's gotten better?
Yeah, I do, definitely. In the over the years, I've seen it improve. Definitely.
It's been an issue for you, Bert?
No, not really. I mean, I think for the most part, attendings.
Can everyone hear? Can everyone hear Bert?
The residents have not specifically been complaining or letting me know about issues like that, both in confidential evaluations when they have a chance to complain or directly to me. So,
Okay. Well, even in
That's not been
confidence, they're not talking about it.
yeah.
Melanie, has it been an issue for you? Melanie's probably busy with the kids. Like I would imagine that she can't.
I'm right here. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
My boys are yelling. I'm so sorry.
And it's perfectly fine. I love hearing the sound of children in the background, so don't worry about that.
I'm here.
Has it been an issue for you in terms of the learning environment, receiving complaints or seeing environment, an environment where it's less than respectful, or where students feel intimidated or residents feel intimidated?
Not really. I haven't heard anything. But I don't know if our program director or assistant program director have heard any complaints, but I personally have not heard that.
All right, I'm very glad to hear it. I have to be honest, I'm very aware and conscious of it, but I'm just thinking about, for example, today, I got frustrated because I haven't been on service. There was a lot of holes in the sign out and information that was really, I thought, important. And, an objective person on the outside listening probably clearly could detect that my voice changed a few times on rounds. Now, I obviously don't mean to be intimidating, and I try to make it a learning environment about why it's so important to have known something in particular and that we needed to go retrieve that and get it. But we're all human beings, and especially I think in the heat of the work that we need to do, sometimes that stuff comes out. But again, I just think it's important that we focus and indeed put an emphasis on that. And I hopefully in the small group sessions, when you're working with the groups, that's something that hopefully that gets raised. The other subject that I think that we probably have not spent as much time on, that I think probably needs a little more focus in the smaller groups in part 2, is narrative assessment. I know from talking with the clerkship directors that indeed a lot of their narrative written assessment from residents and from faculty is quite superficial, very subjective, and not very useful. And that's something maybe we can talk about a little bit later. But those are the two areas that I think have come up in our own personal review of the needs assessment of the part 1 that we've done. So let's just walk through very quickly sort of the models for learning and educating at the School of Medicine that we've promoted and indeed are encouraging the house staff and faculty to adopt in a consistent way, because this is what the expectations are that we've given to the students. In terms of the self-directed learning model, we've really focused with the students on having growth goals, having an individual learning plan, as all house staff are expected to. And in particular, with the house staff, we've talked about the master adaptive learner model, which we also talked with faculty. In terms of creating a positive learning environment, we have a very strong focus on creating an inclusive communication style, utilizing complex questions to really draw all levels of learners into the process, which is really so critical. And we actually spent a little bit of time in the workshop talking about inclusive communication and how to use questions in a non-threatening, but importantly, thoughtful way. So not asking pointed level 1 questions about facts, but more importantly, application or synthesis or analysis questions where you can really let a resident or student think through the problem and have an answer. You know, we talk about, you know, organizing the clinical learning environment, especially around this issue of learning objectives in the 1-minute learner model, which is so central to everything that we do. The evaluation process and the evaluation tool around the EPAs I've already mentioned. You know, giving structured feedback with the forward feedback model is also one of the core models that we have. And then of course the diagnostic process. So I'm really just outlining the subject areas, but each of them are wrapped around a specific model or specific process that we've encouraged the students to utilize. So what I'm doing here is just proposing some of the active, interactive kinds of things that can be done in the workshops. I'm not necessarily saying that you need to do 6 workshops. It really is meant for everyone to mix and match these. You know, some of you may want to bring topics together and combine them into one workshop. Some of you may want to do this in a resident retreat in a half a day and actually do it in a condensed kind of way, which actually psychiatry did a couple of years ago. It condensed the number of these elements. Some of you want to add sessions related to your own specific parochial needs, like teaching in the operating room, for example. So don't get me wrong by me suggesting that these all need to be individual workshops. I really would love to see everyone really take these elements that are in the core material and mix and match it as you see necessary within your own department. But in the first proposed workshop really is all about, you know, the residents in terms of their own individual learning plans. Everybody has to have an ILP. I mean, it's part of the RRC process. Your program directors are going to be very happy with you that you're encouraging to work on their ILPs. And actually this workshop would really be, I would encourage everyone to have basically the residents bring their ILPs, talk about exactly how they're implementing them and using them in the program, and then force them to make the step beyond just preparing for their boards, which often is what ILPs are focused on, and really have them start to think about, how am I going to organize learning for the next 40 years? How do I capture my clinical experience in a HIPAA compliant way, indeed retrieving information from my clinical experience? How do I incorporate conference notes into my learning? How do I incorporate the reading that I'm doing from various resources in some way that's easily rememberable and retrievable? And I think to a large extent, these discussions should focus around what should be my regular literature reading, or should there be some other tool in in my subspecialty area that allows me to see the literature in an efficient way. When I was reading the literature in pediatrics on a regular basis, there was a newsletter, an evidence-based newsletter that would review the world's literature and would condense down the most important articles that they felt were evidence-based. And I was able to read a vast swath of the literature in a very efficient way. That's just one example of a tool that you may want to discuss with your house staff in this workshop. You know, what skills do they have for searching evidence-based databases? Are they skilled at searching PubMed and or using DynMed Plus or whatever specific database that's evidence-based and proctored do they utilize? And I'm always struck, I have to say, I always push residents when I have a clinical question. I always tend to push them and tell them, how'd you get the answer? And I'm really quite amazed at how many of them really just rely on Google and do not have advanced search skills in PubMed or in the Cochrane database or other proctored evidence-based data sets. I'm really surprised by that. And I would not make the assumption because they're digitally native and advanced that they're not necessarily falling into the potential trap of Google. Now, I don't mean to disparage Google completely. Actually, Google Scholar actually has some really, I think, some excellent tools. But I think it's absolutely critical, that we talk about these skill sets, and indeed, how do you organize clinical questions? How do you search the literature? And I would even encourage people to utilize their local librarians in potentially helping to build a workshop around, okay, let's find information about topic X. How do you search that? How quickly can you find it? What are the keywords? How do I explode a term in PubMed so that I'm actually searching what I think I'm searching for? And again, I am always surprised how relatively primitive their skill sets are. I don't know, what's been your experience for those of you interacting with the house staff in terms of their digital search skills for finding literature, especially evidence-based literature? Melanie, what's your experience been?
So my residents really love the ACOG app that they use to reference like practice guidelines. We have practice bulletins and committee opinions. So that's, I know it's not Google Scholar or PubMed, but that's like a very quick way to get to those practice guidelines that we rely upon. In terms of literature searches, they seem to do pretty well with using the resources that are available to us through the library. I know our residency program offers sessions with the hospital library, so they are very efficient at accessing that website and all the search engines and textbooks that it offers. Of course, they rely on Google too, but it seems like they still manage to pretty much be, or they're pretty proficient in pulling evidence-based resources.
All right, well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, obviously the ACOG practice guidelines are critical tools. But again, they're obviously have a very specific approach to specific issues that are very parochial to your world. Being able to broaden the searches out to other ones is really critical. Your house staff, what do you think in terms of their skills, their search skills?
I actually think they're pretty good because my residents need to present M&Ms very frequently, and so they need to do a literature review that's more than just a Google search.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Obviously my primary interactions with pediatrics, so I have to admit that I don't have a really broad view of all house staff, but I'm always sort of struck. But I'm very glad to hear that everyone's developing these digital skills. But these are just illustrations of potential areas that would be quite active in terms of, so what should they be using? Should they be using, and you mentioned the ACOG practice guideline app, how would they use, for example, PubMed or Dynamed Plus, or the Cochrane database or other evidence-based, kind of places that they can run to. So, and again, in workshop 1, the master adaptive learner is the model I specifically reference. And for those of you hopefully have had a chance to grab the master adaptive learner book, I've really enjoyed it. It really gives a nice broad view of lifelong learning. And of course, the other assignment I think that's useful is ask the residents, how are they creating their own personal filing systems to keep track of learning across all of these different platforms and all these other things. And I think our librarians at the School of Medicine are very active in it. This is the master adaptive learner again. And again, I usually put up a little slide about, okay, so how you keeping track of all your learning over the next 40 years. I also do mention to them in the part 1 workshop of the Finding Information Framework, which is a specific framework we teach at the school. I find it somewhat useful. I don't really push it all that much, but the idea of the Finding Information Framework is that most questions are foundational background questions about the basic science, anatomy, pathology, pathophysiology, molecular biology, and other questions are foreground questions that are more clinically relevant. I find in the clinical setting, they mesh into each other so much that I'm not sure that this kind of artificial division is that useful, but just so that when a student says, is that a background question or a foreground question, you sort of have an idea about what they're talking about. In the second one, in terms of the creating a positive learning environment by design, the real focus, I think, needs to be on communication skills and questioning skills. Although I recognize that the clinical learning environment review process that's going on in residency programs, a lot of the topics overlay directly with creating positive learning environments. And again, I think it probably would make sense for you to tap right into what exactly is going on in your own programs around CLEAR projects related to the learning environment for the house staff, and extend those into how do we apply this to the students. I think, in Rattle, we explicitly talk about everyone feeling involved and included, and indeed, obviously having a respectful environment and using higher order questions to not intimidate people in particular. And this is actually one of the slides I always use with the residents in the part 1 about engagement, safety, and environment. And these are just some of the sort of broad areas that we touch on that I think are useful. And I would certainly incorporate these into one of the sessions as you see fit. And here are many of the communication skills that we talk about as potentially useful for engaging students. My own personal experience is that the best way to build an easy, personal, a positive learning environment is really self-disclosure, admitting your own ignorance readily and comfortably, and then indeed modeling, going to get the answer. I find that is probably one of the most important things, especially among young learners who are sort of looking up to you as, is the oracle. To see you looking for information, I think is really quite powerful. Of course, using humor and trying to lighten things up is always useful as well. My own personal use of baseball sometimes annoys people, but I always find it tightens to lighten the mood a little bit as well. And of course, Bloom's taxonomy, I could not fail to mention as an important tool to teach house staff to indeed develop questions that are not just at level 1 knowledge, but are indeed at the higher order of judgment, which is so critical. Now, the workshop for number 3 is really all about learning objectives in the 1-minute learner. And my suggestion for this workshop, and it doesn't necessarily be isolated, is, does the house staff know the core learning objectives of the clerkship? Do they know the core problems that a student needs to be able to address? And do they know the core sets of skills, procedure skills or other skills that they're expected to learn? And of course, this session, can be run by saying to them, well, what do you think the core knowledge, skills, and attitudes are for this clerkship? And have them derive them and then match up with what you're actually doing. I always find it sort of interesting, and it might be a source of editing the clerkship learning objectives when you have house staff saying, I always ask them the question, what would you be embarrassed by if a student had done a 6-week or 8-week clerkship in your area and they didn't know about this? And that's one way to frame it and actually have it be a working workshop where people then get to list 10, 12 things like that. And then you compare and contrast them and then show them the actual list of what the real learning objectives are. So that's actually sort of fun. I've run that multiple times, and it tends to be really fun. And I actually often find that the house staff are editing our actual learning objectives in a very positive way. So that's sort of an easy, sort of self-running kind of workshop that's really simple and runs itself. And of course, the other part of this is making certain everyone knows the 1-minute learner and its 7 components, which we've talked about 100 times. But more importantly, this model really works best, I think, in an ambulatory, outpatient, general practice kind of setting. How do I modify this? In the busy emergency room. How do I modify this in a busy labor and delivery service? How do I modify this when working in a surgical environment? And I think that's absolutely critical. And insert here for the surgeons teaching in the operating room, for the emergency medicine people, teaching in the emergency room, and indeed interacting in very short periods of time with very problem-focused kind of work. So there are many ways to modify the 1-minute learner. Beginning with a huddle and then moving on to the other steps is far from just 1 minute. How do we modify this in your environment? And let us know how you modify it. we actually would love, I know Miriam Hoffman, who wrote the original article on this, would be fascinated to actually write a follow-up model of how the 1 Minute Learner has been modified for the purposes of working with it in the real world. So hopefully we can collect some of that information from you. And I think it's important, obviously, again, to reemphasize the importance of the learning objectives that we've just discussed. What's the learning objectives for this day? Go back to the 8 core competencies that everybody has to know anyway. And of course, the focus on the EPAs and the CET as an entree into the next session, which is really so critical. And I always bring the core competencies up because obviously the house staff need to know this. And I just remind them it's a great opportunity to do that. The 4th session also, I think, runs itself. It's just a matter of creating, showing the comprehensive evaluation tool and how it's built around the EPAs, how to basically use it, and basically creating, specialty specific scenarios, either videoing them or doing them as role plays, and then having everyone in the room basically judge them. Say, was this a good job? Where would you grade this particular student in terms of their presentation? And indeed, you can use role play and or demonstration of a specific scenario, have individuals do the grading and then do it as a group, and then indeed discuss it so everyone sort of gets calibrated on what does it mean to take history in a physical exam in a particular specialty, and what does a 3 competent history look like, and what does a 1 look like, and what does a 4 look like. And again, I think that's a relatively simple exercise. It's a question of just creating the scenarios. How are you going to do them? Sometimes you can find videos. There's a couple of videos that are in the public domain showing people in the emergency room setting. Ideally, you can find videos in your particular specialty and calibrate the CET, have the students and residents being calibrated on how the CET works. I usually in this session actually bring the CET out, let everyone sort of see it. If they haven't, let them play with it a little bit and actually have them use it around specific EPAs. So again, that works pretty fast and pretty much on its own. And I would actually argue workshop number 5, exactly the same, is create a bunch of scenarios where you have a student doing a presentation to a preceptor. The preceptor then gives feedback to the student. A third observer watches them do feedback and gives feedback to the person who gave feedback to the student, have the discussion, and everybody rotate positions. And if you do that with 2 or 3 different scenarios, each person rotating into the different roles, you've got an hour-long workshop done already with a lot of people getting experience in giving, receiving, or judging the quality of feedback using, of course, the Forward with Feedback model. And again, I think this model is so critical for everyone to be comfortable with, for everyone, house staff as well as faculty, as well as students, that there's a clear identification of what the learning objectives are, how the student self-assesses, what your observed gaps and strengths are, and creating a coaching plan that is smart and can be followed up. And again, it's so important to really focus with the house staff about how really feedback needs to be specific, in terms of its detail and what can get better. And we often say that feedback should also be smart. That is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. Should add that later. And then the last workshop is all about diagnostic process and diagnostic error. And again, I think the attitude part of this is so critical. I come from an age of training where diagnostic error was really buried, pushed aside, not really brought out. There was a very litigious environment around it, and everyone was sort of worried about malpractice. And hopefully that attitude has really shifted, both on an institutional level and an individual level, that you recognize that, error, diagnostic error in particular, is really part of practice. It's everywhere. And that indeed recognizing it and using it as opportunities to grow and learn is important, in full transparency for the patients and everyone involved is really so critical. We do spend a little time talking about the dual processing model, as a model for thinking about how to do diagnostic error. But this workshop, I think, best works by just saying, bring your errors. Show me, bring errors that you've been involved in and or you've watched, and then have them just discuss the cases and take those cases apart in terms of what were the elements that went wrong, how can we improve it, and how do you learn from these particular errors? And of course, engage students in that process as well. And again, I included some slides about some of the culture, and I have this little slide about, indeed, we have to stop and smell our errors in terms of improving things. And again,
They smell like shit.
they smell like what?
Except that the error smells like shit.
Well, it's important that we smell, even if they smell like poops. And actually, I'll put a slide in that has, stool. I think that's actually a great idea. Sometimes they do smell like stool. Dual processing model, for those of you who are aware, we spend not a lot of time, but we do use the dual processing model of Pat Crosscarry to sort of give a model for diagnostic reasoning. We spend a lot of time with the students doing this because it's so critical. So the finding information framework is sort of a model from the school, the master adaptive learner for self-directed learning, and having all of these various ways of keeping track of the learning for the next 40 years, not just for your boards. The idea about competence EPOs, EPAs, making sure that the residents are comfortable knowing what the learning objectives are, obviously making clear that they've got the clerkship learning objectives. So incorporating your clerkship leads at your sites and or your residency program directors will be critical, because if you're not already those people have a very big vested interest in residents getting good at this. So incorporating those other resources into these workshops, I think, would be critical. Certainly the clerkship leadership in your particular site would be really critical to bring in the specific learning objective workshops that I talked about. The 1 minute learner is the backbone of organizing at clinical teaching. Modify it as necessary. I didn't really talk about the Stanford Faculty Development Program, but that's a model for doing teaching rounds with multiple people that we indeed present to the house staff. And indeed, the slides have a little bit of detail about how to structure heterogeneous learner rounds on inpatient services. 1 minute preceptor is a way of presenting, for students presenting. The comprehensive evaluation tool obviously is critical to the evaluation process and absolutely central. And being able to calibrate people to that is one of the core things we need to do in part 2. And then, of course, developing the forward feedback skills that we talked about is absolutely critical. And I think the other key thing is making these models our own. Excuse me 1 second. And again, I think I can't emphasize enough how critical it is that we really need to modify it, mix, match, create, 2 workshops, 3, 4, 6, depending on what the needs are, but really make these models yours. Use scenarios that are yours. Have house staff be actively involved in it. These should not be lectures from the slide sets that we've created in a reiteration of the information. All of the house staff, and I think almost all of the more senior residents, have already seen this. And this is about using these models, actually practicing the use of these models so that they can go out and utilize them with the house staff. I can't emphasize that enough, because I know the bunch of times when we've sat in, the slides got used that we sort of sent out, and it was really a repetition of the lecture that they received. And that's clearly not our intention of having that done. And again, I think there are many opportunities to make this come alive that I've just suggested. I mean, obviously, we're here to help you develop these workshops. Obviously, we do not have the bandwidth to be able to do them directly, although we've been very involved in a number of departments and we're more than happy to participate in the creation of them. I'm bold enough to give you my cell number and let you use it, so please write it down and grab it. And I basically have been willing to do everything, everywhere, all at once. Great movie, by the way. I was still not sure I understand it, but I've watched it twice already. And then, of course, Joe Martinelli, who introduced himself in the beginning, and George Knoll will be breaking down by specialty. I took the liberty of splitting the specialties up, guys. I really didn't discuss the final pathway, but we'll be involved in different ways in trying to help you get these things coordinated. Hopefully Joe and George are okay with it. And actually, while I have everybody, also just want to say a thank you. Frankie is going to be moving on to another part of the network and won't be joining us after about another month or two, but he's been an integral part of the team, and I just want to publicly thank him for all the work that he's done for us in the past. And with that, I'm curious about what you have done. I've left not a lot of time at the end, but I'm very curious for each of you that are on, how have you structured the workshops? Have you done, how many have you done? What kind of active interactive processes have you utilized? How have you modified them to make them come alive? And that's a very specific question for the 3 people who are running Rattle in their given areas on the phone, on the call.
Hi, Sarah. Oh,
who's going first? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me now? It's Sarah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I would say that we did like small group discussions, and everyone really had about internal medicine cases, and I think everyone had a great time discussing these cases and how to. I think with residents, it's really helpful for them to understand how to take care of students, because they, like the students work with them on their patients together, and for them to like learn how to be a teacher to those students, that was really beneficial. And like, to have it in like a formatted way, and like, sorry, my kids are screaming.
That's okay. Then, we love children.
Yeah. So, like to have it, like, for them to be instructed on the way how to do it and to post everything in a question format, I think that's been really helpful. Like when you ask a question, I feel like it's more thought provoking than to just like deliver information, basically. So
may I ask, how many sessions did you run over the past academic year in Rattled?
So I didn't do that many, but I did like about 2 of them. And it wasn't, last year it was like a little slow, but we did about 2 of them, and they really enjoyed the ones that we did. Okay. So I hope to do like all of them this year.
Well, we would love if you set up a schedule of when and what the specific topics are going to be. If you could send that to us, we would love to, 1, to know that, and 2, potentially just to come down and watch, because obviously you do it in the context of your regular academic day. Is that how you do it?
Yes, exactly. During our noon conference, basically.
Very good. Bert, Bert had to run out, but Bert and I actually worked together this past 2 years, and actually we participated in those structured scheduled sessions. We ended up doing 4 of them all together. We actually created one completely different from what I've listed, related to teaching in the operating room. It was actually an academic interest of mine a long time ago, and we actually studied teaching in the OR with a number of different models. So Bert and I actually did that together with the house staff here, and we stayed on target. We spent a little time on calibration and feedback, teaching in the operating room, when we spent a lot less time with the 1-minute learner just because of the nature of surgery. And we did it on their academic day. We usually on a Tuesday morning, and we did them an hour at a time. So we did about 3 or 4 hour sessions over this past year. And moving forward this year, we're planning to probably do exactly the same. Have probably somewhere between 3 or 4 1-hour workshops with the faculty, with the residents on their academic morning. Melanie, would you like to share what you've been doing?
Hi. Yeah, so how we've structured it is we've done it during our resident didactic sessions. What we typically do is we'll do it 2-hour sessions 3 times over the year. So our first one for this year was actually today. It was this afternoon. And then I have one scheduled in October for the residents, and then one in December. And essentially we break it up similar to how you structured it today. And what I found has been very effective is having a very interactive session, breaking off into small groups several times throughout the session. So for example, today we talked about ILPs. Our residents will quarterly do learning action plans anyway, so it kind of goes hand in hand. We're getting to the edge of the quarter now anyway. But we talked more globally about like a learning plan for life. So discuss that. And I heard some really great discussion, especially between our senior residents and our junior residents, just about like setting goals early on in residency and then how those goals change and develop over time. And then also about achieving different goals, like especially academic goals and how to study and how to structure their learning. And then we also talked about in the second hour today, it was interesting, you talked about like establishing a safe learning environment, because we actually discussed that as a group, just discussing in general what we feel makes, or the residents were discussing, what makes a resident or an attending a good teacher, an effective teacher, and then hand in hand how they feel safe in that learning environment. So anyway, just a lot of discussion, a lot of interaction, a lot of breaking off into small groups. In previous years, role play has been very, very helpful. The residents have a lot of fun doing that. And it seems like they get a lot out of it.
Excellent. You should just send us the dates if you can. And if you don't mind, if you can send me an invitation, because every once in a while I am physically here and I would love to be a fly on the wall and help in any way I can.
Sure, we'll do.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much. It is exactly 6:30, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for those of you that have joined us. And we look forward to hearing from you on terms of the dates. If you can send us the dates that you're doing it, especially those of you down at Jersey Shore, we'd love to come visit and poke our heads in and see exactly how things are going. So please let us know. And we'll be happy to hopefully see you in the real world. Thank you so much for joining us, and everyone have a great night. Thanks again.